Crowdsource the Truth viewers, and frankly, many Americans have been watching for years, Jared, wondering what's going to happen to General Michael Flynn. How are you, Jared?
Doing well. It's good to be with you, Jason.
You look like you are on an expedition of some kind. This is not your normal location. Do you care to reveal where you are?
Yeah, Elizabeth and I and our family are in Seoul, South Korea right now. We've been here for about a month.
Wow. How's it going?
It's good. I'm happy to report that Seoul is open for business. People are out and about. The restaurants and bars are absolutely packed. And even though most people wear masks outside, but you have to realize a lot of people wear masks outside in Seoul anyway because of the air quality. But once they get inside to the restaurants, the masks come off. People are packed in elbow to elbow, enjoying themselves, eating, drinking. It's sort of a good feeling to be back in society.
Right. And people know that Beck and Lee, the law firm that you and your wife run, is in South Florida. And we've been hearing here in the United States that there is a dramatic uptick in coronavirus cases in Florida. I'm not sure that I believe any of these official numbers, but it is good to hear from you and see what's going on elsewhere in the world. We've heard a lot of good things in the news about the Korean response to coronavirus, but what we really want to talk about, Jared, is that just today, is it the Second Circuit Appellate Court? No, that's in New York. Tell us what happened.
It's the DC Circuit, which is the appellate court that oversees appeals from the District Columbia trial court in the federal system. Basically, in a 2-to-1 decision, ruled that the case against General Flynn must be dismissed, notwithstanding the trial judge's appointment of what's called an amicus of the court to argue against dismissal, even though both the prosecution and the defense had agreed to jointly dismiss the charges. So definitely a victory for General Flynn.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people feel like what happened today was essentially the end of this prosecution. I'm going to call it a persecution of General Flynn, but some of the legal eagles in the Crowdsource the Truth audience have already sort of noticed something that you said to me earlier, is that there is a possibility of this on-bank review. What do you anticipate is going to happen next here, Jared?
You know, it's really hard to say because it's such an unusual posture. Ordinarily, in the course of a lawsuit, if you lose the appeal, the party that loses has an option to file what's called a motion for an en banc review, in which they ask the entire the slate of judges sitting in the court to review the decision of the 3-court panel. Or they have the option to go directly to the Supreme Court and file a petition for review there. In this case, there is no losing party because both the prosecution and the defendant were on the same side in terms of wanting to get the charges dismissed. If there's any losing party, it's the district judge himself who appointed an amicus to argue against the stipulated dismissal. And that raises the question of whether the court itself can and will make a petition for en-banc review. I don't know. It's kind of uncharted territory. This is such an odd procedural posture, and it happens so rarely. And but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, he went to a pretty extraordinary lengths to appoint an outside lawyer to represent his interests in the trial court. So he may very well have that same lawyer file a motion to have the entire D.C. Circuit review the decision. I wouldn't be surprised.
I mean, it seems pretty much a guarantee that that's what's going to happen. You're talking, of course, about Judge John Gleeson, who, in a really surprising move, was appointed as essentially a special prosecutor. I thought that this opposition to the amicus brief that John Gleeson entered, the opposition, of course, written by Sidney Powell, it was just devastating, both to Gleeson and Sullivan. Frankly, I don't see how they can survive this with any credibility.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jason. It's very, well, it really should offend people's sense of justice to have a situation where both a prosecution and a defendant agree that charges should be dismissed, and then a judge steps in and basically assumes the mantle of the prosecution because he doesn't agree with what the Department of Justice says. I mean, this is not the way our system is supposed to work. Some countries actually do have judges that are more like prosecutors, and they take a much more active role in the prosecution. That's, for example, European legal systems tend to be like that. But the American system, it's almost always the case that the judge is a neutral, or supposed to be a neutral arbiter between the adversaries, whether we're talking about a civil case or a criminal case like this one. And it's the prosecutor who has the discretion of whether or not to prosecute. So if the prosecutor exercises his or her discretion not to prosecute, that's not something that the judge can reasonably question or challenge. So I think it's just very, very odd that the judge took this step to begin with. And I think it's sort of a demonstration that, in my opinion, and also based on my years of practice in the American legal system, that the wheels are coming off. And we're going to start to see these strange and unfortunate political battles more and more waged within the judicial system, which really goes contrary to the principle of rule of law, in my opinion.
Yeah, and frankly, it seems like a lot of the judges' behavior is contrary to the concept of justice itself. There are some real stunning sections to this brief here from Sidney Powell in opposition to the amicus. At one point, she's telling us this court must grant the government's motion to dismiss with prejudice, meaning the government can't come back and charge him again, to which General Flynn has consented. She references the electronic court filing where that consent is given, and they've foreclosed all relevant precedent from going behind the current record on the government's motion to dismiss. Fundamental principles of the separation of powers foreclose any such inquiry. I mean, she's not just making argumentation here. She's suggesting that Judge Sullivan is acting in a way that is so egregious that it goes to the very root of the American system. Separation of powers is a key element of our government, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's what I was alluding to when I mentioned the concept of prosecutorial discretion. In other words, it's the prosecutor in which discretion to prosecute resides, not the judiciary. There's a fundamental separation of powers there. And in this case, the Department of Justice is part of the executive branch, not the judiciary. So when the judge comes in and says, I'm going to appoint a special prosecutor to argue for a prosecutorial position against General Flynn, well, then the judiciary is assuming the mantle of the prosecution, and you've mixed the branches' powers where they must remain separate and discrete.
It's actually like tyrannical to do that. This is a judge who thinks he can do whatever he wants. Constitution be damned, facts, DOJ be damned. This is a big deal right here, because I agree with you, Jared. I think they're going to do everything they can. We've seen these deep state swamp rats in basically full exposure for the past 3 years, even when they don't have the facts on their side, when they don't have the law on their side, they don't have logic on their side, they just don't give up. They just keep pressing with whatever nonsense and lies they want people to believe.
Yeah, I think you've got, the way I see it is you've got various factions of the deep state are doing open battle with each other. In this case, you've got an Obama-appointed judge. And by the way, the D.C. Circuit was split 2-1 along political lines. Okay, so I think it was a Bush appointee and a Trump appointee were in the majority, and it was, again, you had an Obama appointee dissenting and writing an opinion that Judge Sullivan was correct in what he did.
Wow.
It's not unusual to see ideological splits in judicial decisions, but I think this is really a naked exposition of two warring factions of the deep state going at each other, and it raises all kinds of questions in my mind. Why were these charges even brought in the first place? It suggests to me certain troubling things about Trump's DOJ from the beginning, that they felt comfortable bringing these trumped up political charges against a Trump ally from the beginning. Then the nature of the DOJ changed enough so that the DOJ agreed to dismiss the charges. But it just shows you the level of infiltration and intrigue that's going on between these disparate factions, and they really are in a war for survival. I think they're doing everything they can to push their ball forward, facts and law and principles of justice, and the Constitution be damned.
Yeah. And if my memory is correct, this all came about like around December of 2016, when the transition was still happening. President-elect Trump hadn't yet been inaugurated, and there was a real sense that General Flynn was going to be a tremendous ally for President Trump, having been a former high-level member of the Obama administration as the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He famously said that it was his feeling that ISIS had been deliberately created by Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. And of course, Donald Trump ran on a platform of hashtag lock her up. And that was one of the main reasons I voted for him. I have to say, it's one of my biggest disappointments in the Trump presidency that has not moved as significantly as we would have hoped.
Or at all, really. I mean, Nobody's been locked up. And I think you go back to the beginning of the Trump presidency, there was a lot of hope that he was going to really, put his foot down and do a proper draining of the swamp, which everybody who I think in the Trump camp was really hoping for and eager to see. Instead, we got Jeff Sessions appointed, and I think Jeff Sessions was really a terrible appointment. I think he stalled the campaign platform and took himself out of the Russia investigation, and he basically allowed the DOJ and to run roughshod over Trump's agenda. And as a result, Flynn was charged, and it took a long time to unwind that. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, if we're going to right this ship, it has to be done quickly and decisively. And I just don't see that happening. I mean, this whole Flynn, I think it's good that the D.C. Circuit ruled the way it did, but this is unwinding a mistake. This isn't really making progress. So, it feels like kind of a hollow victory for law and justice, because it never should have happened from the beginning, at least in my opinion.
And to be totally clear, although it is a tremendously positive thing that this decision came down, it's actually not yet a victory. There's a very high likelihood that Emmett Sullivan and John Gleason and whoever else they can scare up, we're going to continue to badger General Flynn. I mean, obviously they know he's one man. He's not a billionaire. They're the government. They have virtually unlimited resources. They could sue this guy all day from now until his grandkids are dead, right?
Well,
I mean, not sue him, prosecute him.
Well, to be fair, I mean, once the case is formally dismissed and that decision's upheld, then you have the issue of double jeopardy. So you can't really bring charges against him again. So that's a good thing. So I wouldn't think he'd be subject to a second prosecution. But yeah, I do see Sullivan directing an appeal on Bank, and who knows what the full D.C. court's going to do with that, and then up to the Supreme Court, which, I mean, I don't have a lot of faith in the Supreme Court myself. Yeah. To do the right thing. I do think, though, if there is any hint of objectivity left in our legal system, you really don't want to give judges the ability to act as prosecutors. I mean, that is really changing the fundamental nature of the American justice system to allow a federal judge to veto a prosecutor's discretion. I mean, you just imagine the ramifications of that. Even if you think that, we have a problem with our prosecutors or our prosecutorial system, you really don't want to introduce precedent which allows judges to act in this way, because it gives them a power that they shouldn't hold under our system. And there's a lot of federal judges across the country. So just imagine you're basically delegating the prosecutorial power to a whole swath of people who can act as petty tyrants, which I don't think anyone wants. So if there is any hint of objectivity and it ends up before the Supreme Court, I gotta think that the Supreme Court's gonna say, no, this isn't proper. If a prosecutor and a defendant move to dismiss charges, then the judge is obligated to dismiss those charges. End of story.
I mean, this is essentially like judiciary jury nullification, right?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. And it's basically turning our system into another legal system that wouldn't be recognizable for American lawyers. I mean, it's not how we're
or American citizens. It puts all of us in jeopardy for this type of power to be even allowed to kind of exist for a moment. I didn't realize there was a split in the 3-judge panel. That's pretty scary that somebody with a law degree could look at this fact pattern and everything that's come out. I mean, there has been some debate on this show as to Emmett Sullivan's desire to try to raise a perjury charge. My understanding is that's on the basis that General Flynn had pled under oath that he had lied, and now in taking that back, the original plea is what Emmett Sullivan is considering perjury. However, aren't there a lot of cases, Jared, where, we've heard about these guys who are in jail for 20 years and then DNA evidence gets invented, or, they discover a new way to figure something out and they're proven that they didn't do it. And even if they were found guilty, that gets overturned because new evidence has come out.
Yeah. That would be highly unusual to prosecute him on the basis of a plea that was done in the face of evidence that was being withheld. And I just, look, I mean, in our system, I really don't think, as a general matter, confessions or plea deals are worth much because there's just so much coercion that exists. Everybody who practices criminal defense law in the system tells me that. I mean, and there's a real penalty for going to trial if you're innocent. So a lot of people who are completely innocent cut plea deals because they don't want to be sentenced to the max by these petty tyrant judges who want to punish them for exercising their constitutional right to go to trial. I mean, so I mean, it's a pragmatic dilemma that people are up against once they find themselves in the criminal system, and it applies not just to high-level officials like General Flynn, but to everyone, people across the board. Judges will penalize you very, very heavily for going to trial, so that if you're found guilty, they're invariably going to hit you with the maximum, which I think is a real shame. I think people shouldn't be penalized for exercising their constitutional rights.
They shouldn't be denied their constitutional rights. I want to reiterate for our viewers, maybe some people are seeing us for the first time, this exculpatory evidence that would prove that the defendant is innocent, it's legally mandated that the prosecution must present it, and in this case, it's been suppressed. We're learning now that there's even more exculpatory evidence that perhaps was suppressed even to this day, including evidence that indicates that former President Barack Obama and incompetent former Vice President Joe Biden were directly involved in this.
Wow. Yeah, I haven't read that yet. What exactly is this about?
Well, Biden had said he knew nothing about this; they weren't involved, and now there are some additional text messages coming forward. This has just come out recently. Charles was mentioning it earlier, but there appear to be additional text messages that reveal Joe Biden and Barack Obama having direct involvement in this, even directing the investigation potentially. I mean, this is such an attack on the very fabric of the United States of America. Every single person involved needs to be really closely scrutinized, including Susan Rice, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Jim Comey, everybody at the FBI, and now Emmett Sullivan.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think scrutiny is only the beginning. I mean, there need to be prosecutions, and there needed to be a prosecution of Hillary Clinton. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen. I mean, it's just not going to happen. It's very, very depressing from a rule of law standpoint that what seems so obvious to be criminal activity, corrupt activity, we're not going to get justice for this. It's just going to, what's going to happen instead is you're going to have this pattern of conduct repeat itself every time there's a presidential transition. So, and it's going to go, it's going to switch from side to side depending on who becomes the president or the new administration. And there's never going to be any repercussions. And, I don't think the system can sustain itself indefinitely without making these what I think we agree are necessary prosecutions and holding people accountable for their actions. It's just not gonna work. I mean, at some point the whole thing's gonna collapse. I think we're starting to see that. I mean, I really think, I think there's a big connection between what's going on in the courts in a case like this and what's going on in the streets with private property rights are being run roughshod over, constitutional rights are being run roughshod over. Law and order is sort of it's a very insidious thing. Once you attack it someplace in the system, you see the effects over the entire system, because you're presenting an image to the country that you can violate the law and get away with it. So that's going to hold true for high-level officials. It's also going to hold true for people in the streets. And they're going to start tearing down monuments, and they're going to start busting stores and setting fires and looting because you haven't set a proper template for the enforcement of rule of law. And that's why these cases are so very important. And it's very unfortunate that we've gotten zero prosecutions from the Trump administration. And, meanwhile, the Democrats are going to get away with running roughshod over constitutional rights. And they're going to do it again and again and again. Once you allow someone to do it one time, you set the precedent.
Well, you actually just read my mind a little bit, Jared, because I was going to bring up this thing that I observe where this does trickle down to the street. We've had a real lot of conversation lately about this concept of defunding the police, which is seems to me like an idiotic idea, a recipe for disaster just on its face, but yet no one has even really delved into the details of what that means. We've already seen Mayor de Blasio cut the NYPD budget by $1.1 billion. It's clear to me that New Yorkers are in much graver danger just leaving their homes or even being in their homes than we were just 3 weeks ago. The latest thing that is being discussed among supporters of this defund the police notion is this concept of qualified immunity. And it's my understanding that police officers have qualified immunity because if you knew you had to engage with dangerous, violent psychopaths and that you might need to use force to beat them up, to do various things that are normally grounds for prosecution or civil action, you really do need to give a law enforcement officer some form of immunity from these prosecutions, or they just will not have any ability to do their jobs. Now, as I understand it, there also is some qualified or perhaps unqualified immunity for prosecutors in doing their jobs in court, which is why we often see unscrupulous lawyers bring vexatious lawsuits with false accusations so that they can publicize smear campaigns essentially against targets with no risk of them having any repercussions. What can you tell us to clarify? I know my understanding is not to the letter of the law. What kind of immunity does a federal prosecutor have for violating these Brady Acts and all this prosecutorial misconduct?
Right. Well, I mean, as a general principle, if you're acting in an official capacity, you're immune from civil liability. I mean, it's that simple. Now, if you take actions that go beyond your responsibilities, I mean, in theory, you can be held liable, but I mean, I don't know that the problem with what we're seeing right now in the judicial system or with the police necessarily derives from the concept of immunity. I think there's something more systematic and fundamental that's going on. I do agree that there is systemic racism among the police that's been a problem for a long time, but I think a lot of it, comes from how police are trained, and also the fact that the streets of the U.S. are just very, very dangerous places, and in a lot of places it's like a war zone. So to just target the police as being the problem is to sort of miss the entire picture of society, where we should be asking ourselves why our urban areas are deteriorating so much, and not focus on necessarily these technical legal concepts as the problem, or these slogans like defund the police. I mean, in my view, defund the police is all about laying the groundwork for privatizing the police. I really think that's the direction we're going in, just like with the prison system. I think, our local governments are They would basically like to wash their hands of the police budgets and the responsibility for the real thicket of problems that the police system has become, and just put it into private hands, as much as we've done with the prison system. And that really hasn't worked out very well. And I think it's going to lead to additional fragmentation of this society, so that if you're fortunate enough to live in an area that can hire, a powerful private police force to protect your property and your community, you're going to be okay. But if you're unfortunate and you live in an area that isn't high income, you're basically going to have no police force. I think that's where we're going. And it's going to be in a situation much like we see in Latin America. I mean, this country's, I think it's descending more into a highly stratified Latin American model, where the wealthy live in highly protected enclaves, and the rest of society lives in favelas, and the two don't come into contact. But you really have to watch your back if you want to leave your enclave and go out into the street. And that's not the America I grew up in, and I don't think it's the America that I want to live in, quite frankly. But I think that's where we're headed, and I think that's what defund the police is all about. I think it's getting people used to the idea of separating the police function from the government and putting it in the hands of private corporations, which I'm sure would love to build a lucrative business model like they've done for our prison system, which hasn't worked out well at all, especially for the minorities that find themselves in prison. I mean, the private prison system has been brutal to minorities, and because there's no oversight. Okay, once you privatize, you take all of the oversight and the checks and balances out of the equation, and you allow these corporations to run the prisons, under a shroud of darkness. So ironically, you have this Black Lives Matter movement, which is on its face supposed to be all about achieving racial justice, but it's actually being shepherded in this direction, which I think is going to have horrible repercussions for not just for minorities, but for everyone who wants to live in a society that has a well-run, responsible police force that is subject to government oversight.
And this article from the Washington Post is talking about how Vallejo, California, in 2008, under a budget crisis, cut its police force in half. And it basically seems like the remaining understaffed officers, I guess due to increased pressure on them and fear and who knows what, officer-involved shootings went up dramatically. So I have a different understanding of defund the police, but the fact that we don't know exactly what it means, I think in part demonstrates how disorganized this Black Lives Matter movement is. There's no clear leader. We've just heard yesterday or the day before in some sort of mission statement or manifesto that they are Marxists. And, this was a movie that I enjoyed very much as a kid, but the 1987 film RoboCop presented us with a dystopian future in which exactly what you've just described came to pass. A corporation was running the police, and in this film, it envisioned a future where sophisticated technology allowed this corporation to actually roll out robotic police. Seemed like totally ridiculous at the time, but a fun movie if you were a 12-year-old kid. And now, however, we are living in a world where the concept that literally anthropomorphic robots could in fact carry out a variety of duties that might include being police. A lot of people have seen these Boston Dynamics robot videos where the latest iteration of this Atlas robot is able to carry out acrobatic feats that I certainly can't do. So who knows what this type of technology is capable of. I don't know that a privatized police force is the best idea.
No, I think it's a bad idea, but it's, it represents a fundamental shift in our society, and I think that's where we're headed. Frankly, I think that in order to, I think that these riots, these protests, the coronavirus, they're all part of a coordinated psychological operation to push the United States into certain policy choices that are they're going to have multiple effects. One of them is going to be changing the nature of policing. I think education is another one. The coronavirus has basically shut down education in this country. It's really ironic. At the same time, you have people out in the street, tearing down statues and yelling slogans. You have schools being shut down, and this remote learning. I have two kids who did remote learning last semester, and it was really unfortunate to have to see that as a parent, because it's not real education. You have kids who are expected to log into a website every day and watch some videos. Okay.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons we actually traveled to Korea for the summer was because we wanted to enroll our kids in a real school.
Yeah.
Because their education was totally mostly a bust for the last semester. And I've actually seen statistics where, for example, this is interesting. So in the city of Baltimore, 35%, after Baltimore shifted to remote learning in the wake of the coronavirus, 35% of Black students just totally dropped off the map and never logged in once.
Whoa.
To their classes. Yeah, this is some pretty crazy stuff. So think about that. 35% of Black students just totally dropped off the map because a lot of people actually don't have access to the internet, especially in poor areas. So,
right.
And their parents, maybe they don't have the means or the ability to make sure their kids are like logging on from home, even if they do have access. And so you're basically ending up with a situation where on the one hand, people are out in the streets yelling about, racial inequality, but, the fundamentals of racial inequality aren't being addressed, which is the fact that how are you going to achieve racial equality in a society where you're not even providing fundamental education to people? I mean, it's not going to happen. But I think there's a parallel effort along with the police that goes to education, which is another big budget item for localities. And I think they want to get out of the education business as well. And we're shifting to not just a privatized model of education, but a remote model of education, which is really going to leave a lot of people in the dust. And it's going to be terrible for society in the long run because you're just going to have more and more people that essentially aren't even going to school.
Well, and they're also not going to be socialized in any way. I mean, certainly learning whatever nonsense they're trying to teach you is only part of the experience of growing up and going to school. Interacting with other humans your age, learning about all the things that we need to know to be socialized in society is a really important aspect. But you were talking about these attacks on monuments, on statues and things like that. A lot of people think maybe it's not that big a deal, it's just a statue, but yet we've got the mainstream media is still referring to the people that engage in these activities as protesters. Isn't it true that this is an insurrection, Jared? These are people who are destroying federal property, making decisions without a vote to eliminate statues. Last night in Madison, Wisconsin, a statue of, was it Hans Christian Heg, was destroyed. Right. Pulled down the street. This was a guy who emigrated from Norway to the United States in 1850 or something like that, participated in the Civil War fighting against slavery. And right. He probably, I would assume, still has family, maybe his grandchildren or great-grandchildren are still alive, and he's got to be the pride of the family, having a statue there at the state capitol. Now it's been destroyed. I mean, this is a desecration of the man's legacy. What do you think about all this with the statue destruction?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's not just this guy in Madison, but I think Ulysses Grant was pulled down in San Francisco.
Andrew Jackson was attacked in Washington, D.C.
Andrew Jackson. I mean, but Ulysses Grant, I mean, you can't think of anybody who led the charge against slavery more than Ulysses Grant, who won the Civil War for the Union. And then, Cervantes, the Spanish author of Don Quixote, I mean, was pulled down in San Francisco. I mean, what's that all about? The guy who lived in poverty his whole life. I mean, he has nothing to do with slavery. So, yeah, this isn't... I think we should be very, very disturbed by this, because what it reminds me of more than anything else is the Cultural Revolution that happened in China in the 1960s, when the youth were mobilized and weaponized to go around the country and violently attack symbols of basically Chinese, ancient Chinese culture and traditions. And it very much was a deliberate effort by the Communist Party, then under Mao, to cleanse China of any remnants of its past, so that a new society could be grafted onto it. I mean, it leads me to believe that this whole thing that we're seeing is actually straight out of the Chinese playbook, and that China is probably involved at some level behind the scenes. And I think we should be very, very concerned about this, because the violence, the desecration, I mean, it seems very indiscriminate. It seems directed at statues, not necessarily.
But not even statues that they know who they are of, right? Or what those guys did.
Exactly. It doesn't seem to have a logic or a coherence, and it seems to be something at the same time which is very much, as you mentioned, being encouraged by the mainstream media, rather than critiqued or criticized, or there's this refusal to separate the concept of peaceful protest and demonstration, which is a perfectly fine thing to have in a democracy. I mean, people should be free to go out into the streets and state their views. Here in Korea, when we were in quarantine for 2 weeks, there was a protest that peacefully gathered outside of our quarantine facility because the local people were upset that there was a coronavirus hotel that had been established in their neighborhood. And so they had loudspeakers, and they blared this message every night about how they weren't happy with what their government was doing. But it wasn't a violent protest. Nothing was being destroyed. It was just people stating their opinions, and they were allowed to do it. I think that's fine. That's a sign of a healthy democratic society. What's not healthy is to have indiscriminate destruction of property. And, quite frankly, I think a lot of this stems from the fact that we haven't had a functional democratic representative system in this country for a long time. Because if we did, we might have had processes and procedures for discussing and then remedying situations such as statutes that people find offensive or anachronistic, and removing them in a logical and appropriate manner.
Yeah.
But what we have instead is a lot of angry, frustrated people that are being stoked by the mass media. They're being agitated. They've been confined indoors for a number of months due to the coronavirus, which, when you're confined indoors, you tend to get very antsy and anxious. They're watching TV, which is telling them they're going to die if they come in contact with another human being. And then they're, being shown these images, certainly, watching a man get executed by the police in plain view of the cameras is not something that is going to make people happy or calm. So it just seems very much deliberately stoked and propagated to have this effect that we're seeing now, which is indiscriminate violence. I mean, whether it's looting, rioting, or desecration of public monuments.
Yeah, and you know what? I couldn't agree with you more. I think you might even be pulling the punch a little bit. This has been straight up endorsed by Andrew Cuomo. He's defended the destruction of U.S. monuments, saying it's a healthy expression. This is the same jackass who just a couple weeks ago literally issued an executive order saying that this woman and me and other people who were just standing around having a conversation about some of the concerns. There hasn't been a double-blind, placebo clinical trial regarding the efficacy and the safety of using one of these medical masks. But in the middle of a polite conversation with this woman, and we weren't in disagreement, nobody was throwing any rocks, nobody was saying FTP or anything like that, but these plainclothes police officers burst into the park with a loudspeaker telling us that by order of the governor, the park is closed and everybody needs to disperse. So apparently destroying public property, intimidating the public, undermining the rule of law, that's a healthy expression according to Andrew Cuomo. But exercising your First Amendment right to peaceably assemble, this guy doesn't even need to show me a badge. He just needs to represent that he's a police officer, tell me to get the hell out of the park, or I could talk to a judge about it if I want. And there's obviously a show of force. I'm going to turn around in a moment here and we see a line of police officers. This is just, it's so devastating to even contemplate this, Jared, because we want to try to operate within the system, and there is just an unbelievably overwhelming amount of evidence to show that, as you've just said, the officials in charge of running this city are doing everything they can to exhaust every opportunity for people to respond in a civilized manner. And I'm in no way advocating the behavior that these insurgents are engaging in, destroying public property, destroying private businesses. It's just so horrendous to me. I don't know what we can do.
Well, I really don't know what we can do either, other than protect ourselves and stay out of the crosshairs as things heat up. I don't think there is a solution within the current system, because I think the system is fundamentally broken. Our elected leaders, or our so-called elected leaders, are nothing more than puppets for oligarchic interests, many of which are not even based in the U.S. So we're really dealing with foreign infiltration at the highest level. We have a lot of foreign interests that really do want to see the U.S. crater economically and socially, because they have economic incentives to, I think in a nutshell, have the petrodollar system implode. The petrodollar system, I know that you've had shows about this, but I think it's important that people really get their heads around what the petrodollar is all about. But it basically has been a boon to this country's economy for many years, but other countries like Russia and China pay a big economic price for the petrodollar system, which essentially forces the world to trade oil in dollars.
Yeah.
And because of that, there's a huge incentive to have the U.S. crater socially and economically, and that's why I think that these foreign interests are really behind a lot of what's going on in this country. And people like Cuomo are nothing more than puppets and vessels for these foreign interests to work their chaos in the United States. And I'm not really sure that there's much we can do other than, as individuals, just to stay abreast of the situation and try to keep out of harm's way. But I see things just getting worse and worse and worse. I don't really see anything happening for the better until there is a cratering and maybe a reconstruction of American society and a reconstitution of the American Republic from the ashes. I mean, I hate to say it. I'm somebody that generally, I like to be optimistic and I like to be productive. I mean, as you know, my wife and I fought a pitched battle against the DNC for 4 years, and we went all the way up to the Supreme Court. We sued the DNC for fraud in the conduct of the 2016 primaries. We lost in the district court. We lost in the 11th Circuit. We petitioned the Supreme Court for review, and the Supreme Court came back with one word, which was denied. So,
Wow.
We sort of, this was actually a couple months ago, and very disappointing. I think that, we had evidence, not only volumes of documentary evidence showing that the DNC rigged the 2016 primaries, but we had admissions in court by the DNC's own lawyers that they believe they have no obligation to run free and fair elections in this country. But it was very depressing to get to that end result after 4 years of fighting this battle. But what it showed me is that the system really isn't there for any other reason at this point in time other than to protect the mandarins that have been installed into positions of political power. And as a lawyer, that's sort of a depressing thing to have to come to terms with. But at the same time, reality is reality. I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, I think that there's a real effort going on in this country to see the society and the economy crater, and to foment a civil war. And we're in the beginning stages of it, unfortunately.
I fear you might be right, Jared. I hope we're incorrect. I want to ask you about this. Are you aware of this National Governors Association and this collaborative meeting with China?
No. What's this?
Well, this is a meeting that happened in Kentucky where Chinese People Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries and the Commonwealth of Kentucky hosted this summit for governors, and several governors of states from the United States attended this thing. Seems like a great way for Chinese interests to gain influence with our sort of state politicians. And, now we see the destructive things that Andrew Cuomo has done. I mean, it's just hard to imagine that it would be anything other than deliberate. I showed that Ho Chi Minh graphic where he's talking about open up the prison doors and the real dragon will fly out. It's my understanding that that is where the defund the police movement comes from. I think the Black Liberation Army and the Black Panthers were behind this. They think there should be no prison, that the system is corrupt and it just imprisons. I mean, look, I agree. There's a lot of corruption in the legal system. I'm a little bit more of the mind that I'd like to fix what we have and eliminate the corruption rather than destroy it and rebuild something from the ground up. But just in the last few minutes that we have here, I want to get back to General Flynn and what it is that you expect to see next. So this on-bank thing, what is that going to entail? How long is that going to take? What's the next steps?
Well, there's about I believe either a 15-day or 30-day window for a petition to be filed, which asks that all of the active judges in the D.C. Circuit review the decision of the three-judge panel that was issued yesterday. Now, what's interesting is that it's again, typically in an appeal you have a winning party and a losing party, and it's the losing party that would proceed to this next step of seeking on-bank review. In this case, who's the losing party? Well, it's not the prosecution and it's not the defendant, because they were both on the same side. So really the losing party is the judge. Does the judge even have standing to file a petition for on-bank review? I'm not so certain that he does. I mean, he's not a party to the lawsuit. It's ironic because our DNC fraud case was dismissed for lack of standing.
Which you actually had standing.
Well, yeah, I believe so, because we had people that were actually defrauded out of their hard-earned money. They gave money to the Bernie Sanders campaign, which was a total fraud and a total hoax, because there was no real campaign. There was just a rigged election for Hillary Clinton. And I mean, loss of money is a classic basis for standing in this country, but the courts went out of their way to write these long opinions that basically said that we didn't have any dog in the fight. But then you have this case where you have no case or controversy because both parties are on the same side of the issue. They both want to see the charges dismissed. And yet this judge has come in and basically manufactured standing by appointing this special prosecutor. I mean, I can't think of an instance where there is less standing than when both parties come into court and say, we want these charges dismissed. I mean, that should be the end of the story. And yet you have a judge who is bending over backwards to create a case and controversy. I mean, it's bizarre. And it's
but there's got to be something underlying, right, Jared? I mean, someone is either directly or indirectly, there is something that is influencing Emmett Sullivan to do this, because it is so far outside the scope of what is normally done. It is so on the edge. And when you read this Sidney Powell opposition to the amicus brief, it's not even close. I mean, this is a devastating document. It is so well written, and it's just on the money with everything.
Right. Right. Well, he's a foot soldier for, the blue deep state, for the Clinton-Obama corporation, or whatever you want to call it. And he's acting as a foot soldier. Unfortunately, how are we gonna rectify the state of American society when the judges are foot soldiers for the deep state?
And that's my next question. Is there any, what will happen? Let's say this totally falls on its face and Emmett Sullivan is found to have been completely in the wrong, judiciary misconduct. What possible avenue is there to do anything about this?
Oh, nothing. I mean, he's appointed for life. Uh, there's no there's no realistic basis for impeaching him or removing him from office for something like this. No, he's just going to continue to sit on the D.C. circuit, and he's going to continue to act as a foot soldier for the Obama Clinton contingent of the deep state.
Wow.
And that's, it may be a flaw in the Constitution. I mean, maybe lifetime appointments for judges are, turned out not to be such a good thing in the long run. There's a lot of
I think
things in
so.
the Constitution that maybe we're realizing now are flaws, or we don't have the kind of protections that we should have. I mean, we're a young country at the end of the day. I mean, we only go back a couple hundred years, so we're learning as a society that, our Constitution needs to be improved, which is why I say that perhaps the end game here from the point of somebody who's trying to maintain optimism is a reconstruction of our republic and learning from what's happening today in order to come up with amendments to our Constitution that will prevent the kind of societal fragmentation and warfare and infighting that we're experiencing now. I don't know. I don't really have great answers to that, but
Jared, Mark Bird says criminal conduct can remove Emmett Sullivan. I mean, surely if he walked out onto Constitution Avenue and shot somebody in the head, he wouldn't be able to continue to be a judge. So there's got to be a line there where if
yeah.
he is shown to have engaged in criminality, I mean, what would be the process? Is it Sidney Powell bringing something to who,
No,
or
it's an impeachment process. It would have to the same
Congress?
type of impeachment. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and it's happened a couple of times in the history of the U.S. that judges have been impeached. I mean, there was a judge in Florida who was impeached like a decade or two ago, and I believe it was a bribery situation. So something like bribery. Alcee Hastings was his name. He actually ended up getting elected to Congress after
Right.
being removed.
I think you told me
being
about that
removed.
before.
Yeah. So which is a whole other issue. I mean, why are we electing people to Congress that are impeached from the judiciary?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, the bar is very, very high. Impeachment proceedings. I mean, we just went through that with Trump. I mean, they're not a pretty process, and they're highly contested. But I don't think like something like appointing a special prosecutor would rise to the level of
Well, I'm talking about abusing the guy's constitutional rights. That's what it would be. How can you be a federal judge if you don't, respect the Constitution? It seems like the opposite of what you're supposed to do.
yeah, I agree. It's
Well,
unfortunate.
I have a feeling, Jared, that we're going to see the prolonged persecution of Michael Flynn, because it's a virtual certainty that they're going to, go for this next phase and take it to the Supreme Court. Even if they know they're going to lose, they want to continue to put financial and psychological pressure on Michael Flynn. Eventually, even if Sidney Powell is doing this for free, eventually it would put financial pressure on her. They know they're dealing with two individuals, and they just, even though they got really no game, they just keep playing it and playing it and playing it and wait.
Right. Well, because the best defense is a good offense, right? So if you want to protect the Susan Rices and the Obamas and the Hillary Clintons, you continually play offense, right? And even if the offense is frivolous, because every moment that this prosecution of Michael Flynn continues is another moment that resources or attention can't be devoted to the activities of Susan Rice and Obama and Biden that are, really the issue here. I mean, this is really, we're in really, an incredible moment in this country's history where uh, I don't think we're ever going to see another peaceful, um, smooth transition of power from Republican to Democratic or Democratic to Republican administration in this country. I think this is the new normal, just like
Wow.
coronavirus is the new normal for our uh, day-to-day interactions. I think in terms of the politics and the transition in this country, the new normal is infiltration, spying, prosecution, every time there's an election, every time there's a transition from one administration to another. And it's just going to get worse and worse and more odious and involved, and until the point where I think the system's gonna buckle.
Wow. I hope that's incorrect, but it's a pretty concise analysis, and you may in fact be right. The other thing that's happening now, after weeks of civil unrest and severe violence in many major cities around the United States, the mainstream news has taken to ratcheting up the coronavirus fears again, just as people who have mustered their last bits of strength to open their small businesses and try to get their lives back together. Now, certain states that were opening are considering closing again. It's really very disheartening. Jared, I appreciate you taking your time out of the early day there in Seoul, Korea, to join us and discuss some of these things. Will you be returning to the United States, or will you relocate to Korea?
No, we're coming back in August. We're just here for the summer, just to get the kids some schooling, and we have some clients here that we're visiting with. But hopefully we'll be coming back to a country that's calming down and recovering, instead of one that's getting worse and more violent. I mean, I'm very concerned about the corona situation in Florida, I have to say. These new reports of Florida spiking lead me to believe that there's going to be a major shutdown in Florida and California, and it's just going to it's like a ping pong. You start off in New York, you shut down New York, then you shut down Florida and California, and the economic ramifications are going to be extraordinarily awful. I mean, I don't see how. I mean, I've been watching your reports from on the ground in New York, and I just don't see how businesses can possibly survive repeated shutdowns. And I don't even think we've begun to, as a society, to understand the economic ramifications of what's been done.
I absolutely agree with you on that, Jared. I think the businesses that we see remaining in New York City right now, the privately owned, non-corporate, it's basically the walking dead. I just don't think it's going to be possible for these businesses to maintain. I don't know what else to say. Jared, I really appreciate you coming on the show. Enjoy the day. I know you're starting your day there in Seoul. I've been to Seoul, Korea. I'm sure you know it far better than I do. I'm trying to think if there's any place that I can tell you to go to, but I don't even remember the name of anything or how to get anywhere, or like nobody in Seoul, Korea, except for this one guy that they had assigned to me spoke English. So luckily you've got Elizabeth with you there, and you guys can make your way around.
It helps. It helps.
Yeah. All right, well, say hello to everybody, Jared. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. And after August, if anybody is in the South Florida area in need of a trial lawyer, they should contact Beck and Lee Trial Lawyers and get Jared and Elizabeth on your side. If the judiciary remains standing, as you've suggested, I do want to thank everybody for tuning in and remind people that they can sponsor the show by going to subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I forgot to mention earlier today that I actually posted a bonus video only on Patreon and Subscribestar of a journey from the Upper East Side of Manhattan back down to Chelsea here, where we got to see another neighborhood that is a very high-end, expensive real estate, store after store after store for rent.
Wow. Well, just one thing,
Yeah, sure.
Jason. Yeah, people can feel free to contact us now. If I
Ah,
mean,
oh,
we're still working. I mean, I mean, hearings in Florida are all done by
all
remote
right.
Zoom. So we've already done. Elizabeth did a deposition yesterday. We've done
Wow.
multiple hearings while we're here. So we're not stopping just because we're out of the country. And so if people have legal questions they want to ask us or issues, feel free to send us an email, and we'll get back to you. But we're fully open for business now. So
Excellent. Well, forgive me for that incorrect
oh
assumption. And I mean, in some ways, that's actually a benefit to your industry that you can operate remotely now. So
yeah,
hopefully people will contact you. Jared, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us tonight. And thanks everybody
oh,
for watching.
always a pleasure, Jason. Thank you very much.
Likewise, Jared. Take care. Have a great night, everybody.
Okay.